the budget deficit balloons, only a few people in Washington seem to fucking give a shit. Um, the federal budget deficit is ballooning on 45's watch, and few in Washington seem to fucking give a shit. And even though I'm not from the Washington D.C. area, but I do give a shit about the budget deficit and everything. And even if they did, the political dynamics that enabled bipartisan deficit cutting deals decades ago has disappeared, replaced by bitter partisanship and chronic dysfunction. That's the reality that will greet 45's latest budget, which will promptly be shelved after landing with a thud on Monday. Like previous spending blueprints, 45's plan for the 2020 budget year will propose cuts to many domestic programs favored by lawmakers in both parties, but leave alone politically popular retirement programs such as Medicare and Social Security. Washington probably will devote months to wrestling over erasing the last remnants of a failed 2011 budget deal that would otherwise cut core Pentagon operations by $71 billion and domestic agencies and foreign aid by $55 billion. Top lawmakers are pushing for a reprise of three prior deals to use spending cuts of new revenue and prop up additional spending rather than defray deficits that are against approaching $1 trillion. It puts deficit hawks in a gloomy mood. The squatter doesn't care. The leadership of the Democratic Party doesn't care. Said former Senator Judge Gregg, who's a Republican from New Hampshire, and social media is a stampede mode. 45's budget arrives as the latest Treasury Department figures show a 77% spike in the deficit over the first 4 months of the budget year, which is driven by falling revenues and steady growth in spending. 45's 2017 tax cut bears much of the blame, along with sharp increases in spending for both the Pentagon and domestic agencies and the growing federal retirement costs of the baby boom generation. Promises that the tax cut would stir so much economic growth that it would mostly pay for itself so far have been proven woefully wrong. 45's upcoming budget, however, won't address any of the main factors behind the growing, which is untraceable deficits that have driven the U.S. debt above $22 trillion. Its most striking proposed cuts, which are due to domestic agency operations, were rejected when Tea Party Republicans controlled the House, and they face equally grim prospects now the Democrats are in the majority. 45 has given no indication he's much interested in the deficit, and he's rejected any idea of curbing Medicare or Social Security, which is the massive federal retirement programs whose imbalances are the chief deficit drivers. An administration official said Friday that the squatters' plan promises to balance the budget in 15 years. The official was not authorized to publicly discuss specifics about the budget before the document's official release, and this person spoke on condition of anonymity. Democrats have witnessed the retirement of a generation of lawmakers who came up through the 1980s and 1990s and negotiated deficit-cutting deals in 1990 and 93, but those agreements came at significant political costs to both President George H.W. Bush, who lost his re-election, and President Bill Clinton, whose party lost control of Congress in 1995. But the moderate wing of the Democratic Party has withered with the electoral wipeout of blue dog Democrats at the heads of a Tea Party forces over recent election cycles. Concern about the deficit is so woefully out of fashion that it's hard to even imagine it coming back into fashion, said Representative Jim Cooper, who's a Democrat of Tennessee, one of his party's few remaining deficit hawks. This is out of fashion as bell bottoms. While in control of the House, Republicans used to generate non-binding budget blueprints that promised to balance the federal ledger by relying on a controversial plan to eventually transform Medicare into a voucher-like program, but they never pursued the follow-up legislation that would actually do it. Republicans who seized Congress more than 2 decades ago, promising and ultimately achieving balanced budgets during the Clinton administration, have instead focused on 2 major rounds of tax cuts during the 45 era and the administration of President George W. Bush back in 2001. Nor are Republicans willing to consider a tough deficit-cutting steps such as higher taxes or Pentagon budget cuts, leading Leading Democratic presidential contenders talk of Medicare for all and increasing Social Security benefits instead of curbing them. You have to get pretty damn serious about revenue as well as defense spending, and those are two things that Republicans don't want to bring into the conversation, said Senator Dick Durbin, who's a Democrat for Illinois. My Democratic friends who talk about expansion of benefits, I've told them to get real. 45 has never gone to the mat for his plan to slash domestic spending much as renewable energy programs. If 45 can be criticized, I think the perception has been that he has not fought for the spending cuts that he's proposed, said former Senator Jim DeMint, who's a Republican for South Carolina. There's no upside to trying to cut anything. There's no political reward, but if you cut something, there's a lot of political downside. Neither is there any reservoir of the political will and bipartisan trust required to take the political heat for the tough steps they would take to rein in deficits, and it's not like voters are clamoring for action. There has been very little dialogue in the last several years about debt and deficit and how to really be able to address it, said Senator James Lankford, who's a Republican for Oklahoma. It just never came up in the 2016 election. It still doesn't come up. The deficit registered $714 billion during 45's first year in office, but is projected to hit about $900 billion this year, according to the Congressional Budget Office, which says 45's tax cut will add $1.5 trillion to the deficit in over 10 years. One of the short-term goals would be, I know it's not a lofty goal, stopping things from getting a lot worse. It's something the Republicans obviously weren't able to do, and that's a low bar, but they couldn't meet a low bar, said Senator Chris Van Hollen, who's a Democrat from Maryland.